Some people still think when CNN says it's the most trusted name in news,
the most trusted name in news,
that's actually true because they said so.
The most trusted name in news.
I came across this article when I was doing another report the other day about the CIA's infiltration of the mainstream media in general. And after going back and reading the entire article, I think we should all read it. I think everyone should have a look at this article. So this comes from the Los Angeles Times, March 27, 2000, and as Alexander Cockburn explains in this article, he only heard of it after a Dutch journalist in Holland reported on it after hearing about it in an intelligence brief that was sent out in France. So that's how this worked. Nobody in the United States was reporting on this article. Today's news is brought to you by Big Brother. A handful of military personnel from the 4th Psychological Operations Group based at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, have until recently been working in CNN's headquarters in Atlanta. An enterprising Dutch journalist named Abe de Vries came up with this important story in mid-February, and he remains properly astounded that no mainstream news medium in the U.S. has evinced any interest in it. Astounded. Really? I came across translations of de Vries' stories after they'd appeared in late February in Trouw, probably saying that wrong, but the foremost newspaper in Holland. De Vries later told me he'd originally come upon the story in the French newsletter Intelligence Online, available on a pay-per-story basis, February 17th, which described a military symposium in Arlington, Virginia that discussed the use of press in military operations. A Colonel Christopher St. John, commander of the U.S. Army's 4th Psyops group, was quoted by Intelligence's correspondent present at the symposium as, in the correspondent's words, having, quote, called for greater cooperation between the armed forces and media giants. He being St. John, pointed out that some Army Psyops personnel had worked for CNN for several weeks and helped in the production of some news stories for the network, end quote. Reading this in Belgrade, where he's Trouw's correspondent, de Vries saw a good story, picked up the phone, and finally reached Major Thomas Collins of the U.S. Army Information Service, who duly confirmed the presence of these Army PSYOPs experts at CNN. PSYOPs personnel, soldiers, and officers, de Vries quoted Collins as telling him, have been working in CNN's headquarters in Atlanta through our program, whatever program that is, training with industry. They worked as regular employees of CNN. They helped in the production of news. I reported this interesting disclosure in Counterpunch a couple weeks ago and made it the topic of my regular broadcast to AM Live, a program of the South Africa Broadcasting Company in Johannesburg. Among the audience of this broadcast was CNN's bureau in South Africa, which lost no time in relaying news of it to CNN headquarters in Atlanta, and I duly received an angry phone call from Eason Jordan, who identified himself as CNN's president of news gathering and international networks. Jordan was full of indignation that I had somehow compromised the reputation of CNN. But in the course of our conversation, it turned out that yes, CNN had hosted a total of 5 interns from U.S. Army PSYOPs, 2 in television, 2 in radio, and 1 in satellite operations. Jordan said the program began on June 7, just before the end of the war against Serbia, and only recently terminated at about the time CNN's higher management read Abe de Vries' stories. Naturally enough, Eason Jordan and other executives at CNN now describe the Army PSYOPs intern tours at CNN as having been insignificant. Maybe so. St. John, the commanding officer of PSYOPs group, certainly thought them of sufficient significance to mention them at the high-level Pentagon powwow in Arlington about propaganda and psychological warfare. Maybe CNN was the target of a PSYOPs penetration and is still too naive to figure out what was going on. Oh, really? Is that really what you think? It's hard not to laugh. Yeah, it's hard not to laugh at the last thing this guy just wrote. But anyways, it's hard not to laugh when CNN execs like Jordan start spouting, as he did to me, high-tone stuff about CNN's principles of objectivity and refusal to relay government propaganda. They just refuse. They refuse to. In the Kosovo conflict, as with other recent wars, CNN's screen was filled with an unending processing of bellicose advocates of bombing, many of them retired U.S. Army generals. Let's give the last word to the enterprising de Vries. Quote, of course CNN says these PSYOPs personnel didn't decide anything, write news reports, etc. What else can they say? Maybe it's true, maybe not. The point is that these kind of close ties with the Army are, in my view, completely unacceptable for any serious news organization. Maybe even more astonishing is the complete silence about the story from the big media. So for just one example of many, in July 1996, when we were all told a bomb went off at the Summer Olympics in Atlanta, directly across the street from CNN headquarters,
we have had word now of an explosion at the Centennial Olympic Park, which, as you may know, is right outside of CNN Center.
We actually were making our way through the park from CNN Center to get to this location when the explosion occurred. It was a very concussive, you could feel the explosion. I didn't see much smoke. Again, there was the explosion. We didn't see much smoke, and there was no visible smoke after the explosion, so we're not sure of the nature of it, but it was quite loud, and then a very loud, very concussive explosion occurred, Andrea.
Can you explain this explosion, Mark, how it sounded, how it felt? I know some people here at CNN Center felt it as well.
It was very concussive. It was...
Okay, Mark, thank you. Mark McKay reporting to us from Centennial Olympic Park, which, as you know, is adjacent, actually, across the street from CNN Center.
Just oh so coincidentally 10 days after the completely suspicious downing of TWA Flight 800, which their own Anderson Cooper, who by the way spent 2 summers, not 1 but 2, interning at the CIA before he decided, oh, I'm going to become a reporter instead, and said that TWA Flight 800 was actually shot down.
Back in July 17th, 1996, when TWA Flight 800 was shot down off the coast of Long Island off New York, killing all on board.
Only to come back from commercial break and say, oh, the government said it was a fuel tank explosion.
Before I do, I just want to correct something I said regarding the plane crash. Earlier I said that today was the anniversary of Flight TWA 800 crashing off the coast of Long Island in 1996. I believe I said it was shot down. Obviously, the government said it was a center fuel tank explosion, though some people had indicated they saw a rocket. There's no evidence of that.
When that same CNN was one of the first media outlets to jump on board with the erroneous claims that the Olympics bombing, which again was perfectly timed to deflect all public attention and scrutiny away from TWA Flight 800, blowing up mid-flight and killing all 212 passengers and 18 crew on board, to the point that even on the monument to those people's deaths, they say that the cause of the explosion is disputed. When they declared that the bombing was perpetrated by AT&T security guard Richard Jewell, who underwent a baseless trial by media for which CNN was later forced to pay Jewell an undisclosed monetary sum in court after he sued them for libel and slander, well, is it any coincidence that just a few years later, while covering war in Serbia, it was also discovered that Army Psychological Operations personnel, officers, and soldiers were actually working directly at CNN headquarters to help produce the derisive air quotes news? Short answer? No. CNN. The most trusted name in bullshit.